If you had to choose where you'd want to travel, what place would you pick? Japan has some of the richest history in the world, musically and culturally. Japan is a country where you can't help but be drawn into their culture and their history to where you want to learn more about it. Japan's history, we'll talk about Japan's history today, their culture and their religion, and most importantly, their music. In early Japan, around 300 BC, the early Japan residents were known as hunters and gatherers. A little after that, they became rice harvesters, agriculture people, and that led to social classes shortly afterwards. And then Buddhism was introduced in the Asuka period, which was 538 to around 700. The historical events, just a few to point out, are the Onin War in 1467. The capital moves to Tokyo. World War I happens in 1914. The Pacific War in 1941. Japan now becomes a member of the United Nations in 1956. And in 2011, most recently, the Great East Japan Earthquake. As far as their environment, climate, and scenery, they do experience the 4 seasons like we do. It does snow in most regions in Japan. In Tokyo, they get a little less than some areas in Japan do. Their summers are really, really hot. They get a lot of rain in spring, so on and so forth. Population in Japan is roughly around 128 million, and that was an estimate done in 2017. Pollution. They do experience a lot of air and water pollution, and it's a big deal down there. And they have a lot of sightseeing, cultural events going on, like the Mount Fuji, Shibuya Crossing, the Tokyo Tower, some landmarks that people like to go and see. They follow 2 religions, and to start with similarities, they both aren't followed strictly. They do coexist with one another, and they don't have a huge role in their daily lives. The only time both are strictly followed are when it involves holidays, funerals, weddings, those sort of things. For differences, Shinto, they pray to gods called kami, and they pray at shrines and home altars. As Buddhism, imported in the 16th century, it was imported from China. Japan's etiquette and interests, they do follow strict etiquette manners. Just to give a couple examples, bowing, bowing's pretty standard in Japan. You bow for greetings and respect. Usually a shorter bow is for greeting, a longer bow is to show sign of respect. And gift giving is also really common in Japan. As far as their interests, just share the same interests as we do. Into sports, theater, music, movies, all that kind of stuff. As far as their holidays go, they celebrate a lot of the holidays we do, but usually in a different manner. So for New Year's, they do celebrate it. It's one of their biggest holidays they celebrate. It's usually just to honor their ancestors and to pray for good health throughout the year. They have Golden Week, which consists of a few holidays throughout the week. They have Constitution Day, Greenery Day for the environment, and Children's Day to pray for their son's health. And they also celebrate Thanksgiving, but it's more for celebrating labor, what people do for their country. And they celebrate Christmas as well, which is just spreading happiness instead of celebrating religion like we do here. They do festivals. It's huge there. Around the country, there's probably around 300,000 plus festivals done every year. At least one city and town does at least one a year, but it's usually more than that per town or city. Festivals usually consist of dancing and art. Festivals, cultural festivals, usually done holidays and for entertainment purposes. Now let's get into the music, which is the most important thing. start off early on. One of their most musical most of their first pieces of evidence for music was the Zotaka bell, which was found around 300 BC. But the first piece of solid evidence of they found was the Haniwa doll, which was found a little after 300 BC. Their music mostly was imported from China and Korea, and they have heavy influence from them. And they introduced Buddhism into their music, which consists of Buddhist chants, which we'll show in a second. In the 12th century, musical theater genres developed, so a lot of singing and chanting became emphasized in the music. The music was mostly dominated by flutes and string instruments. We'll get into a couple of those instruments in just a second. Concerts and drums were popular at festivals now and back in the day. And every region developed certain folk songs for the region. They label music called ongaku, which is the sound of comfort. That's what they go by with music. They integrated Western music from us, such as jazz and rock. We'll get into the genres too. Their lyrics are heavily emphasized in their songwriting. Music is basically for work, events, music careers, so on and so forth. And now Japan is one of the largest physical music markets in the world today. As far as how they incorporate their musical tradition, basically just musical careers, songwriting, festivals, weddings, funerals, concerts, parades, just kind of like how we do it, but more traditionally there. As far as their genres go, they did incorporate Western music, like I said, but they do a lot of traditional music, which is Buddhist chants and orchestral court music. They did incorporate a lot of the Western style of music, such as rock, pop, heavy metal, hip hop. They do a lot of club music, game music. You hear a lot of the style they do, like J-pop and J-rock. It just means Japanese rock and pop that they just made it their own. And I'm going to play a minute clip of what Buddhist chanting sounds like in Japan. You still hear this type of music now in Japan, but it was more common, of course, back in their early history. So they start off with solo, and then more voices get integrated later on. So that's just the premise of Buddhist chant there. Common instruments they use the taiko drum, which is probably the most common drum in Japan. It's used in theater and at shrines. Hear it a lot in traditional Japanese music. They also commonly use it as a decoration piece around houses, at shrines, so on and so forth. The string instrument they commonly use is the koto, which is a solo instrument they commonly use in ensembles. How to play it: use the right hand to pluck the strings, the left hand be used to modify the pitch and the tone. Probably their most famous instrument is the shakuhachi flute. It's one of the most famous flutes known around the world. It was originally imported from China and Korea, and it's just a bamboo flute with 5 or so holes that you blow into. We'll play a minute clip of someone playing the shakuhachi flute. It might be hard to kind of know what the flute actually is by hearing the name, but if you listen to it, everyone would recognize it. It is pretty complex sounding, but it's also very calming to hear by the ear. So you hear it usually a lot in their films or their video games that they always incorporate it into. It's pretty common to hear it. Lastly, I want to talk about some of their older historic composers. First, Kasaku Yamada. He left around 1,600 pieces of music. He conducted operas, orchestra, piano, and choir works as well. Another composer famous in Japan historically is Toshiro Mayuzami. He was a composer for a lot of cinematic films, and he won multiple awards for films. But he also did operas, ballets, orchestral pieces too. And probably the most influential and most famous Japanese composer in their history was Toru Takemitsu. Of course, he's one of the most probably known composers in Japan. He won multiple awards in Japan and overseas for his work in music. He composed nearly every type of music and genre of music, so he's pretty well diverse in what he made. And his mentor was actually Claude Debussy, so he had a lot of influence from overseas composers as well. So I think that wraps up all the music. We covered the history of Japan, their culture, and their religion, and also their music, which is probably some of their most historical rich categories in their culture. Japan is, of course, a country where you can't help but be drawn to their culture and their history. You want to learn more about it. Japan is rich in history and culture, which is why I wanted to do this research project. It gave me a lot more to learn about, and it gave me more of a reason to want to travel there someday. So I appreciate you listening to this presentation.